Now, the Chamber, or the South African Chamber of Commerce rather, and Industry, recently rated the country's business confidence as hesitant. Just how much do we have to look forward to, and can the business sector be revived? Joining me for this and more is Isaah Mhlanga, who is the Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes Investments. I do have Tanya Cohen, CEO of Business Unity South Africa, and also the Chief Economist at Nedbank, Dykes. Tanya, if you allow me to begin with you, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for your time. The recent SACCI figures on business confidence do point to what we know, that businesses in South Africa are not confident. And that's a big issue because we need you guys to be confident in order to help this economy to grow. How are you feeling about the prospects for the South African economy for 2019?
So I think despite the fact that we saw a number of improvements last year in terms of starting to address corruption, putting into place some more stable leadership in state-owned enterprises, and measures that really did indicate that the business sector was being listened to more carefully, there are a lot of issues that we're really worried about. And I think topmost is what is happening at Eskom. From a financial point of view, the economy just can't sustain that cost, and I think from an economic growth point of view, we need a stable and affordable supply of energy. So that, we think, is a really big issue that we need to address as a country. And until we deal with it decisively and we take some actions and have some short-term targets and actually make progress, I think we're not going to see necessarily those confidence figures changing.
Could the economists just forecast or give us their forecasts and how they expect the South African economy to perform this year from Nedbank? Dennis?
Yeah, we're saying about 1.4% this year after about 0.7% last year. So
based on?
Well, based on a number of factors, but the hope that the policy environment becomes more predictable and certain post the election. The one that we thought was going to be a contributor now looks a little bit less certain, which is agriculture, because we've had a very spotty, rainy season. And the other concern, obviously, is what's happening globally, which would put things on the back foot. But I think if we do get a better policy environment, one that actually is attractive to business and local as well as foreign business, I mean, there's no reason this economy shouldn't be growing at much higher levels, even within less favorable global environment.
For sure. Isaah, Alexander Forbes forecast?
Almost similar sort of growth rates, 1.2%. I think
slightly lower?
Yeah, slightly lower. Of course, we don't expect a sudden change in terms of the policy environment. It normally takes some time to turn around policy, and before elections are likely to see any implementation. After elections, you are still going to get some inertia that is going to be still within government as they try to establish a new cabinet and setting up departments. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. By the time that is finished, potentially the year is gone before any implementation of policies. So growth is likely to only pick up in 2020 onwards if they do get the policy prescripts correctly. But of course, we are still operating within a global environment, so we're still at the mercy of what happens in the global environment. If you look at South Africa as a very small open economy contributing just over 1% of global GDP, which means we are going to be influenced by what happens offshore.
Tanya, just going back to Eskom again, we have seen government try and stabilize that ship. Clearly for you and Busa, it's not enough. More needs to be done. Any solutions you can put on the table? It looks like this government is all ears to getting solutions.
So I think the things that we've been looking at within business are certainly around how that debt can be managed, because it simply is an unsustainable level of debt. And I think the other area is how to improve the operations. The appointment of the task team we welcomed. We think it was a very good idea, and we think that starts to put it on the right track. But actually it's time to bring in skills wherever we need to bring those skills from, and really capacitate Eskom so that we can set it on the right path.
Other than Eskom, is there anything else that you're worried about, Dennis, that the government should be looking closer at, and that could possibly, by looking closer at, help to accelerate South Africa's economy?
Yeah, look, I would share the concerns around Eskom. I think that, we've got to get things done correctly on the operational side, otherwise we're going to have all sorts of problems down the line. At the moment, the concentration has been on the financial side. And I think that's not sufficient. You actually need to see structural reform. But I think it goes back to something I said earlier on, and that is you've got to create some sort of predictable environment for business to operate in. You know, I always say that when you arrive in South Africa, there's a long list of requirements as to what you actually have to do to partake in the South African economy, whereas if you arrive in Rwanda, they roll out the red carpet and give you a long list of incentives and what they're going to do for you, you know.
Can you be a bit more specific when you talk about the policy certainty? Well, which policy, though, needs to be made more certain, or what needs to be done?
Yeah, look, I think if you look at the situation that we've had over the past few years, every policy pronouncement adds another layer of cost. And some of these policies are well-intentioned, so don't get me wrong. But if you look at it from a requirement point of view, I would actually like it to be that if you, a foreign investor coming to put in a new activity in South Africa, that there is no other requirement other than paying taxes. You know, I mean, I think that's a fairly reasonable sort of position, because the person's coming in cold, or the company's coming in cold. Instead, we actually put layers and layers of demands, including, you know, giving away equity and so forth.
For sure.
Which again, in the historical context, you can understand, but from an investor perspective, they just sort of look at it and say, well, it's interesting, but I'll go somewhere else until I see how that's all going to pan out.
But is it really different, though, to what they face elsewhere? Because right now the conversation globally is about inclusive growth. Because if you have that kind of situation, you'll just have a scenario where this inequality is exacerbated, and that in the long term is not good for anyone.
Well, no, I don't think it exacerbates inequality. I think a company coming in and creating jobs is actually precisely what we need.
Right.
We need that. It's precisely that which encourages inclusive growth. What encourages exclusive growth is if you've got a small and ever diminishing number of companies and a diminishing number of or increasing number of unemployment. That's what encourages a non-inclusive economy. So we have to think about this, go back to basics. And bear in mind there are many countries who have done that, who are doing exceptionally well. Right. Growing at 7-8% per annum.
But like you say, we can't ignore the historical context. I see you smiling. Come in there, come in there.
Just to play devil's advocate, I think in the mid-2000s, we had very strong growth, but still it was characterized jobless growth. So despite...
We had nearly 2 million jobs.
That's
created.
true. That's really,
I don't buy that it's jobless growth.
That's just a, growth of population.
No, not at all.
It's not really over and above.
Well, we've had jobless growth in the last 5 to 10 years. That's true jobless growth.
That's correct. So my point here is growth alone is not enough. So we can't just say the economy needs to grow first before we can see increased participation of a broader population, because the fact is this: if transformation doesn't take place, the country is not going to be stable.
Yep. And
you don't want an unstable country.
Yeah.
That is not a business case for South Africa. A business case is where you get more people included in the economy who participate and also add value into the economy. So business, government and labor needs to find ways to make that happen in a more conducive way that makes sure that everybody benefits, and even the poorest of the poor, they're lifted out of poverty. That's how you get a stable society. If you get extreme level of inequality, you are not going to get a stable investment environment. So that is a prerequisite that you need.
100% agree, but in actual fact, what we've been doing up until now is creating the very society that you're talking about. Inequality has actually
unfortunately, South Africa's inequality is the highest in the world, despite the growth that we have seen.
This is not something that happened in the past 5 years, though. If we just allow Tanya to come in here for a moment. Tanya, your views?
Yeah, so I agree that transformation is actually probably the biggest priority that we have, because unless we get more people into the labor market and employed, and unless we get more small businesses participating in the economy, we're not going to get the stabilization that we're looking for. We're not going to get the consumption, and we're not going to get the growth. So really for us, the key is around how do you stimulate education and skills for the fourth industrial revolution so that we really can participate in the economy and transform our economy. How do we focus on employment, particularly of young people, and how do we focus on enterprise generation and sustainability, particularly small business? And that's where the policy framework that Dennis is speaking about is just so complex and difficult for small businesses. They're often held to exactly the same standards as very complex businesses and large businesses, and very, very difficult to just keep themselves afloat, but yet they've got all these regulatory burdens that they're complying with. And I think if you look across the different sectors and the regulatory hurdles that they're dealing with and realize that those are just exponentially expanded for small businesses, but it's a complex environment in which we operate. And our laws generally are good. I think the challenge is that they're not implemented, and the alignment and the coordination between different departments is really problematic. So if we look, for example, at carbon tax now, we've got greenhouse gas emissions under Department of Environment, we've got carbon tax with Treasury, it's feeding into the energy issues under the Energy Department, and the alignment between that is just making the environment so complex that we're not going to get investment. But worse than that, we're probably getting businesses that are pulling out and holding back because that framework is so complicated. And we can point to examples in the health sector. Land, we all know that that's a policy area that's very unstable. And we can go through sector by sector and look at policy constraints. Really think that that's a considerable focus. And one of the things that would be really good if we were to do this year is just to slow down on that. Slow down on the new legislation, deal with those big policy issues one by one and carefully,
sure,
and implement what we've got. Because if we implement it, we'd actually do a lot better.
Sure.
I think that's where I agree fully with what you just said. Those are the issues that we need to tackle. If we look at what is being bandied about the fourth industrial revolution, it's not going to happen with the current education system that we have. So it seems to me that we have short-term visions and policies that we have been implementing since 1994, and they don't feed into each other. Each and every 5-year presidential term, there is a new one, which for me is very problematic. If you take countries that have managed to grow fast enough, they have had long-term visions which see continuity between the different changes in political parties or presidents. For us, it seems different. Even currently, there seems to be a scramble to get a new growth source for South Africa, or a new growth plan for South Africa, which means the NDP is almost being watered down. If you look at the details of what the NDP proposed and what is being put together. For me, that is a problem. We have to look further down the road, 2-3 generations down, and say, what do we need to do to get there? But as of the next 5 years, what do we need to concentrate on? We can't do everything at once. Pick 1 or 2 or 3 priorities. Say education. We address education, which means we solve the skills issue. Once you solve that, we say, okay, transport, because you need that connectivity. You solve that. Incrementally, over time, that is how you get growth going. But to try and fix 10 different things at the same time, it's not going to happen because we have so many constraints that we're facing in the economy.
I mean, in terms of education, I'm sure you must have seen the ANC's election manifesto. They say that they would like to concentrate on changing the curriculum to be more tailored towards the fourth industrial revolution. It remains to be seen what that will look like should the party actually win these elections. But Tanya, another issue, a pressing issue in South Africa is that of youth unemployment. One of the things that the ruling party say that could help this is if we drop work experience of graduates as a requirement to get a job. They say that they plan to introduce this in the public sector, and they want to whisper in the ears of the private sector to perhaps take this on board. What's your view on this?
So I think it depends entirely on the job, and it depends entirely on the industry and the business, because you're not going to appoint a very senior person without experience. Very junior people, if there is a base qualification, of course, you're going to be considering that. And I think we've got to recognize that the employment tax incentive was designed particularly to actually enable a young person to come into work, to work and get experience at a slightly lower cost than ordinarily, so that you actually would bridge that wage gap between an experienced young person and a person without that experience. So I don't think it's an absolute requirement. I think that there's a lot of goodwill amongst business to want to try and employ people. The environment's really tough.
Right.
In fact, we're in a job shedding phase. So as much as business wants to be employing and being part of this national project because it makes business sense, besides the fact that I think a lot of businesses are incredibly patriotic, as much as they want to do that, the conditions are very difficult.
I think there's also a lack of appreciation that work experience is not the reason why we are not creating jobs.
Okay.
It's not. Just because the economy is not growing, therefore you don't need as much people to work in a company.
Sure.
So as long as we don't have growth, you can remove work experience, people are still not going to get jobs. They'll get jobs for that 1 year because it's mandatory or because it's policy, and then what happens after a year? That's what you see. A lot of young people that they get in graduate programs, they're not all absorbed because they're just no positions because the companies are not growing. The solution is what she spoke about earlier on stimulating small businesses, because they're the ones that create the majority of businesses. Mature and stable businesses, they don't have the same level of creating jobs compared to small businesses.
So if I understand correctly, I mean, some of the arguments that are being made here, it seems as though Ramaphosa's New Dawn was not that new, because it sounds like the same issues that many of you commentators were crying about, if you allow me to be frank, under the previous administration, continued to be what is holding South Africa's economy back. Dennis?
Well, look, I mean, I think if you look at the ANC manifesto, it's very similar to previous manifestos, and in a sense it's doubling up on policies that have not worked in the past in many respects. And the tragedy is we've got so many plans on the table. I mean, we spoke about the National Development Plan earlier on as well. I mean, there's easily, quickly implementable policies in health, in education, across a whole range of issues, which have simply been ignored. They've just not actually been looked at. So it just seems that we have a serious problem implementing good policies, and we're excellent at implementing bad policies.
Sure.
So I think on the upside, though, I think what we are experiencing is a far higher degree of consultation, which really is welcomed.
Right.
So at multiple levels, I think we are being engaged as a business sector, sometimes along with our social partners, sometimes bilaterally. But we do have a sense that the economy is being focused upon, that it's important, and that there is an intention to resolve it. I think even in Nedbank, I think there's the recognition that unless we can start growing the private sector, we're not going to create the jobs that we need to. So I think it is moving slowly. I don't think there's enough delivery, but we are moving in a much better direction than we were before.
So we are out of time, but I just wanted to spare or sneak in maybe 1 minute, 30 seconds, or perhaps I don't even have that time, 45 seconds. So that's like 15 seconds each as a closing comment. I mean, just as if we really want to get it right, achieve 1.2% or even that 1.9% growth for the South African economy this year, what do we need to do? I know the first thing that was put on the table was implement good policies already, but Tanya?
Well, I think obviously I mentioned Eskom, and I think the other issue that we really need to work on is around a leaner and service-orientated government and public sector.
All right. Dennis?
Look at risk-reward for companies that are considering investments in South Africa. If we don't address that balance, we're just not going to get the economic activity.
Is that?
I think just doing the things that we say we are going to do and implement them properly. Teachers teaching in school, when we say we're going to establish infrastructure, let's do it. When I say we're going to reform the education sector, let's do it. Electricity, let's do it. Just implementing what we have in terms of policies. We are not short of policies as a country.
For sure. And of course, in pursuit of sustainable and inclusive growth in South Africa. But that is where we wrap up our discussion on the South African economy and really how to get things going again. I'd like to say thank you once again to my panelists, Isaah Mhlanga, Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes Investments, Tanya Cohen, CEO of Business Unity South Africa, and Chief Economist of Nedbank, Dennis Dykes.